We're jumping into chapter 11 of Tagore's Religion of Man on the topic of the meeting. I don't know what this is about. I have not read ahead. This is as new for me as it is for everyone else. I don't think much really needs to be said. All we do need is, as usual, a volunteer reader. And like usual, depending on the length of the chapter, the substance of what we discuss, we may choose to just flesh out and have a discussion, just wrap up our reading session tonight, or we'll just discuss and then read chapter 12 after this. So who would like to, Ryan, would you be in the mood to do a bit of reading tonight?
Okay, so it's page 156, right? The meeting.
Yeah, I'm just going to try to maybe make it as optimally large as possible so everyone can see the words properly.
Okay, so our great prophets in all ages did truly realize in themselves the freedom of the soul and their consciousness of the spiritual kinship of man, which is universal. And yet human races, owing to their external geographic condition, developed in their individual isolation a mentality that is obnoxiously selfish. In their instinctive search for truth in religion, either they dwarfed and deformed it in the mold of the primitive distortions of their own race mind, or else they shut their God within temple walls and scriptural texts safely away, especially from those departments of life where his absence gives easy access to devil worship in various names and forms. They treated their gods in the same way as in some forms of government the king is treated, who has traditional honor but no effective authority. The true meaning of God has remained vague in our minds only because the consciousness of the spiritual unity has been thwarted. One of the potent reasons for this, our geographical separation, has now been nearly removed. Therefore, the time has come when we must, for the sake of truth, and for the sake of the peace, of that peace which is the harvest of truth, refuse to allow the idea of our God to remain indistinct behind unrealities of formal rites and theological mistiness. The creature that lives its life screened and sheltered in a dark cave finds its safety in the very narrowness of its own environment. The economical providence of nature curtails and tones down its sensibilities to such a limited necessity. But if these cave walls were to become suddenly removed by some catastrophe, then either it must accept the doom of extinction or carry on satisfactory negotiations with its wider surroundings. The races of mankind will never again be able to go back to their citadels of high-walled exclusiveness. They are today exposed to one another, physically and intellectually. The shells which have so long given them full security within their individual enclosures have been broken, and by no artificial process can they be mended again. So we have to accept this fact, even though we have not yet fully adapted our minds to this changed environment of publicity, even though through it we may have to run all the risks entailed by the wider expansion of life's freedom. A large part of our tradition is our code of adjustment, which deals with the circumstances special to ourselves. These traditions, no doubt, variegate the several racial personalities with their distinctive colors. Colors which have their poetry and also certain protective qualities suitable to each different environment. We may come to acquire a strong love for our own colorful race, a speciality. But if that gives us fitness only for a very narrow world, then at the slightest variation in our outward circumstances, we may have to pay for this love with our life itself. In the animal world, there are numerous instances of complete race suicide, overtaking those who fondly clung to some advantage, which later on became a hindrance and an altered dispensation. In fact, the superiority of man is proved by this adaptability to extreme surprises of chance. Neither the torrid nor the frigid zone of his destiny offering him insuperable obstacles. The vastness of the race problem with which we are faced today will either compel us to train ourselves to moral fitness in the place of merely external efficiency, or the complications arising out of it will fetter all our movements and drag us to our death. When our necessity becomes urgently insistent, when the resources that have sustained us so long are exhausted, then our spirit puts forth all its force to discover some other source of sustenance, deeper and more permanent. This leads us from the exterior to the interior of our storehouse. When muscle does not fully serve us, we come to awaken intellect, to ask for its help, and
I'm
are
so
then
sorry.
surprised. Yeah?
I screwed up. Yeah.
No, I think you're good.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So when our necessity becomes urgently insistent, when the resources that have sustained us so long are exhausted, then our spirit puts forth all its force to discover some other source of sustenance, deeper and more permanent. This leads us from the exterior to the interior of our storehouse. When muscle does not fully serve, we come to awaken intellect to ask for its help and are then surprised to find in its greater source of strength for us than physical power. When in their turn, our intellectual gifts grow perverse and only help to render our suicide gorgeous and exhaustive, our soul must seek an alliance with some power which is still deeper, yet further removed from the rude stupidity of muscle. Here, though, the cultivation of intense race egotism is the one thing that has found its fullest scope at this meeting of men. In no period of human history has there been such an epidemic of moral perversity, such a universal churning up of jealousy, greed, hatred, and mutual suspicion. Every people, weak or strong, is constantly indulging in a violent dream of rendering itself throughout hurtful, rendering itself thoroughly hurtful to others. So let me just read the last sentence. Every people, weak or strong, is constantly indulging in a violent dream of rendering itself thoroughly hurtful to others. In this galloping competition of hurtfulness, on the slope of a bottomless pit, no nation dares to stop or slow down. A scarlet fever with a raging temperature has attacked the entire body of mankind, and political passion has taken the place of creative personality in all departments of life. It is well known that when greed has for its object material gain, then it can have no end. It is like the chasing of the horizon by a lunatic. To go on in a competition, multiplying millions becomes a steepless chase of insensate futility that has obstacles but no goal. Becomes a steeplechase. Okay.
Just quick question. What is a steeplechase?
Not sure.
I mean, it's a race of some sort.
Yeah, you have to jump over a barrier about 1.5 to 2 meters.
On a horse or on with a person with legs?
No, on run. When
Okay.
running, you have to jump over obstacles.
Gotcha. Okay.
Insensate. And what does insensate mean, by the way?
What?
The word insensate. So it becomes a
Insensate.
steeplechase of insensate futility.
Insensé?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
it?
That's yeah.
Okay.
It's Tagore is a very refined man. He used French words.
It says, yeah. So for those who speak English and don't know what insensé means, it's lacking physical sensation or lacking sympathy or compassion, unfeeling. Yeah, without sense. Or completely lacking sense or reason. Yeah.
So let's go on. It has for its parallel the fight with material weapons which must perpetually be multiplied, opening up new vistas of destruction and evoking new forms of insanity and the forging of frightfulness. Thus seems now to have commenced the last fatal adventure of drunken passion riding on an intellect of prodigious power. Today, more than ever before in our history, the aid of spiritual power is needed. Therefore, I believe its resources will surely be discovered in the hidden depth of our being. Pioneers will come to take up this adventure and suffer, and through suffering, open out a path to that higher elevation of life in which lies our safety. Let me, in reference to this, give an instance from the history of ancient India. There was a noble period in the early days of India when, to a band of dreamers, agriculture appeared as a great idea and not merely a useful fact. The heroic personality of Ramachandra, who espoused this cause, was sung in popular ballads, which in a later age forgot their original message and were crystallized into an epic merely extolling some domestic virtues of its hero. It is quite evident, however, from the legendary relics lying entombed in the story, that a new age ushered in by the spread of agriculture came as a divine voice to those who could hear it. It lifted up the primeval screen of the wilderness, brought the distant near, and broke down all barricades. Men who had formed separate and antagonistic groups in their sheltered seclusions were called upon to form a united people. In the Vedic verses, we find constant mention of conflicts between the original inhabitants of ancient India and the colonists. There we find the expression of a spirit that was one of mutual distrust and a struggle in which was sought either wholesale slavery or extermination of the opponents, carried on in the manner of animals who live in the narrow segregation imposed upon them by their limited imagination and imperfect sympathy. This spirit, who have continued in all its ferocious vigor of savagery, had men failed to find the opportunity for the discovery that man's highest truth was in the union of cooperation and love. The process of agriculture was the first external step which led to such a discovery. It not only made settled life possible for a larger number of men living in close proximity, but claimed for its very purpose a life of peaceful cooperation. The mere fact of such a sudden change from a nomadic to an agricultural condition would not have benefited man if he had not developed therewith his spiritual sensitivities to an inner principle of truth. We can realize from our reading of the Ramayana, the birth of idealism among a section of the Indian colonists of those days, before whose mind's eye was opened a vision of emancipation, rich with the responsibility of a higher life. The epic represents in its ideal the change of the people's aspiration from the path of conquest to that of reconciliation.
Just a brief question, probably for Kwan. So the Ramayana, in my ignorance, I don't really know what this is. How old is this epic?
Let's say that as for many things from India, the written form is probably, let's say, 20 centuries old. But the oral transmission is probably from the time of Vedic installation around 1600 CE. But once again, I'm sure that you wouldn't be amazed by Dr. Vedam presentation in 5 or 6 Sundays on those things, because it's still quite controversial. But the official theory now that you have Indo-EU settlers coming from Iran and maybe even the Black Sea, selling themselves in the northwest of India, corresponding to nowadays Pakistan and Punjab in Pakistan and in India, and corresponding to 2000 BC or 1600 BC. And Ramayana is the myth or the ballad or the epic of Rama. And Rama was one of those first Indian heroes before Krishna. So it's an old guy. Probably his myth started 3,000 years ago at least, but the written form is more 2,000, 2,400 years ago. It's for many things Indians.
Okay.
But I'm sure that that we wouldn't be amazed by Dr. Vedam presentation in a month or two, I think.
Yeah, I'm excited by that too. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
No problem.
All right.
So where were you? We're at the progress. We were talking about agriculture.
I think I broke in at the present time, I believe, or yeah, you're at the present time.
Present time, yeah. 163, 62, sorry.
Okay. So, by the way, are there like other questions? Like when should we stop for questions, or we'll just stop?
I would say like usual, if you feel. Oh, go on.
No. Please go on.
Oh, I was just gonna say if you feel something pressing, you stop and ask a question, like we've been doing, and otherwise the technique we've been sort of operating on for the past weeks has been just to read as much of a chapter as possible, and then just open discussion based on the thoughts that we encountered throughout.
Okay. So let me just carry on.
Sure.
At the present time, as I've said, the human world has been overtaken by another vast change similar to that which has occurred in the epic age of India. When was the epic age of India?
Precisely the age of Ramayana and of Bharata and of Krishna and so on. So in the mind of the Indians, the famous battle that started what in their mind is India happened in 3102 BCE. Okay, I might be mistaken by some years, but it has been 5,000 years ago. Okay, so from a mythological and not in the bad sense of mythology, okay, meaning in a representation of the Indians to themselves, their history started 5,000 years ago, and at the battle precisely creating Mahabharata, because the Hindi word for not India, it's Mahabharat. Okay, Great Bharat, which is the name the Indian use for India, and it started 5,000 years ago for them. And for historian and Western historian nowadays, it started between 1000 BCE and 1600 BCE. Okay, but those things are very controversial. But for us, let's say that started 4,000 years ago.
Okay, great, thanks.
No problem.
So, okay, so the epic age of India. So long men have been cultivating almost with a religious fervor, that mentality which is the product of racial isolation. Poets proclaimed in a loud pitch of bragging the exploits of their popular fighters. Monkey makers felt neither pity nor shame in the unscrupulous dexterity of their pocket picking. Diplomats scattered lies in order to reap concessions from the devastated future of their own victims. Suddenly, the walls that separated the different races are seen to have given away, and we find ourselves standing face to face. This is a great fact of epic significance. Man, suckled at the wolf's breast, sheltered in the brute's den, brought up in the prowling habit of that predation, suddenly discovers that he is man, and that his true power lies in yielding up his brute power for the freedom of spirit. The God of humanity has arrived at the gates of the ruined temple of the tribe. Though he has not yet found his altar, I ask the men of simple faith, wherever they may be in this world, to bring their offering of sacrifice to him, and to believe that it is far better to be wise and worshipful than to be clever and supercilious. I ask them to claim the right of manhood to be friends of men, and not the right of a particular proud race or nation which may boast of the fatal quality of being the rulers of men. We should know for certain that such rulers will no longer be tolerated in the new world, as it basks in the open sunlight of mind and breathes, sorry,
Just breathes.
yeah, breathes, sorry, and breathes life's free air. Okay, so in the geological ages of the infant earth, the demons of physical force had their full sway. The angry fire, the devouring flood, the fury of the storm continually kicked the earth into frightful distortions. These titans have at last given way to the reign of life. Had there been spectators in those days who were clever and practical, they would have waged their last penny on these titans and would have waxed hilariously witty at the expense of the helpless living speck taking its stand in the arena of the wrestling giants. Only a dreamer would have then declared with unwavering conviction that those titans were doomed because of their very exaggeration, as are today those formidable qualities which, in the parlance of schoolboy science, are termed Nordic.
Does just sort of trivial question again. When he's describing this, when he's saying Nordic, is he talking about and this is the 1920s he's speaking here, or late 20s? Is he referring to like the Nordic myths of Aryanism and things of that sort that are?
No, it's a bit less problematic than the myth of the Aryans. Do you know the word Hyperborean?
No.
Okay, it's part of the Vedic myth that you have a race called Hyperboreans. Okay, Boreans for Boreos, which is the name in Greek of the wind of the north. So in the myth, collections of the Aryans people, but not in the sense of Hitler, but rather something more noble. You have a group of people called the Hyperboreans, And you can see them as a little bit of the equivalent of Atlantis, if you want. Okay, the idea of an advanced people living near the North Pole. That's why the term Nordic, but nothing to do with Hitler. He
Okay.
just, there's a bad mix with lesser things.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. And you call it Hyborians?
A Hyperborean.
Hyperborean. Okay.
B-O, yeah,
Borean,
from
like Boreal.
Boreos,
Yeah.
the Greek name for the wind. Yeah, that's Boreal, exact. And from the Greek northern wind.
Okay.
So I ask once again, let us, the dreamers of the East and the West, keep our faith firm in the life that creates and not in the machine that constructs. I like this sentence. In the life that creates and not in the machine that constructs. In the power that hides its force and blossoms in beauty, and not in the power that bears its arms and chuckles at its capacity to make itself obnoxious. Let us know that the machine is good when it helps, but not so when it exploits life. That science is great when it destroys evil, but not when the two enter an unholy alliance. So
Now,
how?
yeah, go for it.
So if you take the analogy, you mean for him when he looks at looks at life as a creation and not necessarily you mean contrasts that with the construction that is found in a machine. Like how would you compare those two realms, and why does he bring such a comparison?
Well, I think that you always have to hold in mind the world that he was living in, because he was intervening on certain problems that he saw was sending society as a whole, all religions and all peoples, into a bad place. And he was again giving these lectures in London in the 20s, and his whole life consistently from a very young age to his older years is completely consistent. He's always trying to uplift and fill the gaps that people have in blind spots that are causing them to act like fools and self-destructively. So I think that part of it is to be sensitive to the rise of a mechanization, which was very, very prevalent around that time, and a tendency to try to, like, I think he's directly intervening on a certain racist way of thinking from the very beginning. He's attacking the racialism and this tendency to think of one's own race as superior to other races, which he then links back to something which has caused a lot of species even before human beings to go extinct. And he's then bringing in this question of the moral fitness to survive. It's the literal words he uses when our muscle power fails us and we need to resort to a mind power and a spiritual power that is more powerful than the muscle power, the physical power.
Yeah.
So I think that a lot of this stuff is just intervening on a lot of these bad ways of thinking that are holding us back into the old muscle way of thinking about what is human nature and how do we organize ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's maybe this analogy also like runs throughout this whole chapter, in a sense that you have the life, which is a creative force. It's a creative burst, which and alludes that or attaches that with the spirit, let's say. And then you've got on the other side the mechanical, or the thing which trying to make something better by tinkering on the causal effects of that thing, instead of trying to seek out like, for example, if you're to take an example these days with I mean, whether, for example, those new technologies that you could, I mean, in order to make man more intelligent, you could probably insert the nano chips and his brain in order to tinker with certain cells or create more. I mean, tinkering with the actual mechanics of how of how human thinks versus being able to understand man not as a mechanical entity, but as you mean more, yeah, a spiritual entity.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's not forget that the tour has the title, The Meeting. Okay, I think that we interpret at least that title in two levels. First, the meeting of the different tribes of human beings for a common evolution rather than to go among themselves. And the second thing is that the last paragraph, okay, machine is capital M and science is capital S.
Mm.
So once again, science is exactly the trigram, episteme by Plato, and episteme means exactly knowledge or science, and the machine is the animal kingdom. Okay, it's not only the machine that we produce, it's also the animal machine in which we are. So let us know that the machine is good when it helps, but not so when it exploits life, that science is great when it destroys evil, but not when the two enter into unholy alliance. So, of course, it can be understood as science and technology, but here I think once again, that Tagore is asking for the soul to take the lead in the common adventure of the machine and the soul. And the machine can be a biological machine too, of course. It's not only our machines that we create.
That's a wonderful point that you just made. It's true. Like the idea of the title was very non-literal, right? Like it's called The Meeting. So it's a very good point that you made, that it has these two levels to it, the meeting of humanity, of these different groups, but then this other question metaphor, which is what he ends with, of the meeting of the spirit and science, technology, under the service of good or the service of destruction, based on how we think of creativity, or how do we think of creating through a construct that you're just like imposing your will, constructively building something, or awakening something from within, which gives you a very different idea of whether science is something that we do, or is it something that is like, is it something artificial, or is science something which is spiritual unto itself, and technology is that perhaps itself a spiritual thing? If you choose to look at it that way, it gives you two different effects.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sorry to repeat my the machine is very good. I mean, vitality, intellect, and psyche, it's probably the most beautiful machine in the known universe for us, meaning ourselves. It's not very humble to say that. But for now, the most beautiful machine, human body. But that machine needs to be led by the soul, or by the upper trigram, or by episteme. You choose the vocabulary you like.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the meeting with a capital M, okay? The machine accepting graciously the soul or the upper trigram as its leader.
Mm-hmm.
Juan, for you, so episteme and the soul, they're one and the same?
Yes, but well, episteme is the Greek word meaning knowledge, and for Plato is the upper trigram, or if you want, the divine kingdom, okay? And the divine kingdom is beauty, goodness, and truth, okay, according to Plato terminology. If you don't have that divine kingdom meeting the machine or the animal, the machine or the animal accepting graciously and graciously is the key word. That the leader is the animal, but the divine kingdom. The meeting is not, because the divine kingdom will never force itself on you. Okay, you have to be prepared to accept it. Okay, you cannot force someone to goodness and beauty. That person has to go on a travel of the soul, or on a epistemological journey. Precisely, epistemological journey comes from episteme by Plato, meaning that you go to the dimension of the divine kingdom. Or for people having problem with religious terminology, I use Platonic terminology because Plato is quite okay. He used a kind of vocabulary that is acceptable for people having spiritual and religious inclination, and is also acceptable for people having more scientific or technical inclinations. Okay, goodness and beauty.
Any other thoughts or questions that we want to hammer out before we move on to chapter 12?
I was just thinking that if Tagore wrote this in the 1920s, you say?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be right after World War I, that meat grinder of a war. And he's probably discussing, how do we go forward? What's the future of man gonna look like? Because if as Quan was saying, have the machine accepts the soul as the leader, you can go in one direction. If you don't, you're going to end up heading towards World War II,
Mhm.
which is what happened. But I'm sure that was in the back of his mind when he wrote this in terms of the meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was 1930. I was wrong.
Yeah.
1930.
Well,
But
that was the famous decade, Matt.
Yep. Yeah.
And
Great.
we in a decade resembling incredible 1930s decade. What do you think?
Probably late 30s at this point. Yeah.
And imagine Tagore died in 1941. Desperate when he died.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he lived through a very dense period of world history. I mean, he was must have been born in what year?
1861.
1861. Yeah, he lived through some incredible global events. So to have still been a man, to have been able to keep his faith throughout all of that is quite something.
Well, Matt, I would be a bit of a pain in the neck for the people here, but I think that our period is much more interesting.
Yeah. You're a little biased though, aren't you? Living in your age and all.
What do you think, Matt? That's my machine. That's my machine speaking.
No, I tend to think that I agree with you.
Mhm.
So it's both our machine speaking.
Both of our machines are talking, yeah. But with some fair reason behind our machines. It's true. Like we've never had 8 billion people, and we've never had a coalition of different ancient cultures come together on such a resonance. As imperfect as it is, it's still very, very unique as far as world history is concerned so far up until this moment. So yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Mhm.
Anyway, we're more capable to self-destruct now than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Bigger machines.
Yeah, bigger booms.
Yeah.
Bigger good, bigger bad. All right, who would like to go for chapter 12, the teacher?
Well, I can volunteer if no one else wants. Can you hear me all right with my new mic?
It's great.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, good. All right, chapter 12, the teacher. I have already described how the nebulous idea of the divine essence condensed in my consciousness into a human realization. It is definite and finite at the same time. The eternal person manifested in all persons. It may be one of the numerous manifestations of God, the one in which is comprehended man and his universe. But we can never know or imagine him as revealed in any other inconceivable universe so long as we remain human beings. And therefore, whatever character our theology may ascribe to him, in reality, he is the infinite ideal of man, towards whom men move in their collective growth, with whom they seek their union of love as individuals, in whom they find their ideal of father, friend, and beloved. I am sure that it was this idea of the divine humanity unconsciously working in my mind, which compelled me to come out of the seclusion of my literary career and take my part in the world of practical activities. The solitary enjoyment of the infinite in meditation no longer satisfied me, and the text, which I used for my silent worship, lost their inspiration without my knowing it. I am sure I vaguely felt that my need was spiritual self-realization in the life of man through some disinterested service. This was the time when I founded an educational institution for our children in Bengal. It has a special character of its own, which is still struggling to find its fulfillment, for it is a living temple that I have attempted to build for my divinity. In such a place, education necessarily becomes the preparation for a complete life of man, which can only become possible by living that life through knowledge and service, enjoyment, and creative work. The necessity was my own, for I felt impelled to come back into a fullness of truth from my exile in a dream world. This brings to my mind the name of another poet of ancient India, Kalidasa. I think I pronounce it right. I don't know. Kalidasa, whose poem of Meghaduta reverberates with the music of the sorrow of an exile. It was not the physical homesickness from which the poet suffered. It was something far more fundamental, the homesickness of the soul. We feel from almost all his works the oppressive atmosphere of the king's palaces of those days, dense with things of luxury and also with the callousness of self-indulgence, albeit an atmosphere of refined culture based on an extravagant civilization. The poet in the royal court lived in banishment from the immediate presence of the eternal. He knew it was not merely his own banishment, but that of the whole age to which he was born, the age that had gathered its wealth and missed its well-being, built its storehouse of things, and lost its background of the great universe. What was the form in which his desire for perfection persistently appeared in his drama and poems? It was the form of the Tapovana, the forest dwelling of the patriarchal community of ancient India. Those who are familiar with Sanskrit literature will know that this was not a colony of people with a primitive culture in mind. They were seekers after truth, for the sake of which they lived in an atmosphere of purity, but not of Puritanism, of the simple life, but not the life of self-mortification. They never advocated celibacy, and they had constant intercommunication with other people who lived the life of worldly interest. Their aim and endeavor have briefly been suggested in the Upanishad in these lines. Those men of serene mind enter into the all, having realized and being in union everywhere with the omnipresent spirit. It was never a philosophy of renunciation of a negative character, but a realization completely comprehensive. How the tortured mind of Kalidasa in the prosperous city of Ujjaini and the glorious period of Vikramaditya, closely pressed by all obstructing things and all devouring self, let his thoughts hover around the vision of a tapovana for his inspiration of life. It was not a deliberate copy, but a natural coincidence that a poet of modern India also had the similar vision when he felt within him the misery of a spiritual banishment. In the time of Kalidasa, the people vividly believed in the ideal of Tapovana, the forest colony. And there can be no doubt that even in the late age, there were communities of men living in the heart of nature, not ascetics fiercely in love with a lingering suicide, but men of serene sanity who sought to realize the spiritual meaning of their life. And therefore, when Kalidasa sang of the Tapovana, his poems found their immediate communion in the living faith of his hearers. But today, the idea has lost any definite outline of reality and has retreated into the faraway phantom land of legend. Therefore, the Sanskrit word in a modern poem would merely be poetical, its meaning judged by a literary standard of appraisement. Then again, the spirit of the forest dwelling, in the purity of its original shape, would be a fantastic anachronism in the present age, and therefore, in order to be real, it must find its reincarnation under modern conditions of life. It must be the same in truth, but not identical in fact. It was this which made the modern poet's heart crave to compose his poem in the language of tangible words. But I must give the history in some detail. Civilized man has come far away from the orbit of his normal life. He has gradually formed and intensified some habits that are like those of the bees for adapting himself to his hive world. We often see men suffering from ennui, from world weariness, from a spirit of rebellion against their environment for no reasonable cause whatever. social revolutions are constantly ushered in with a suicidal violence that has its origin in our dissatisfaction with our hive wall arrangement. The too exclusive enclosure that deprives us of the perspective which is so much needed to give us the proper proportion in our art of living. All this is an indication that man has not been molded on the model of the bee, and therefore he becomes recklessly antisocial when his freedom to be more than social is ignored. In our highly complex modern condition, mechanical forces are organized with such efficiency that materials are produced that grow far in advance of man's selective and assimilative capacity to simplify them into harmony with his nature and needs. Such an intemperate overgrowth of things, like rank vegetation in the tropics, creates confinement for man. The nest is simple. It has an early relationship with the sky. The cage is complex and costly. It is too much itself excommunicated from whatever lies outside. And man is building his cage, fast developing his parasitism on the monster thing, which he allows to envelop him on all sides. He is always occupied in adapting himself to its dead angularities, limits himself to its limitations, and merely becomes a part of it. This may seem contrary to the doctrine of those who believe that a constant high pressure of living, produced by an artificially cultivated hunger of things, generates and feeds the energy that drives civilization upon its endless journey. Personally, I do not believe that this has ever been the principal driving force that has led to eminence any great civilization of which we know in history. I was born in what was once the metropolis of British India. My own ancestors came floating to Calcutta upon the earliest tide of the fluctuating fortune of the East India Company. The unconventional code of life for our family has been a confluence of three cultures: the Hindu, Mohammedan, and British. My grandfather belonged to that period when the amplitude of dress and courtesy and a generous leisure were gradually being clipped and curtailed into Victorian manners, economical in time, in ceremonies, and in the dignity of personal appearance. This will show that I came to a world in which the modern city-bred spirit of progress had just begun driving its triumphal car over the luscious green life of our ancient village community. Though the trampling process was almost complete round me, yet the wailing cry of the past was still lingering over the wreckage. Often I had listened to my eldest brother describing with the poignancy of a hopeless regret a society hospital, sweet with the old world aroma of natural kindliness, full of simple faith and the ceremonial poetry of life. But all this was a vanishing shadow behind me in the dusky golden haze of a twilight horizon. The all-pervading fact round my boyhood being the modern city, newly built by a company of Western traders, and the spirit of the modern time seeking its unaccustomed entrance into our life, stumbling against countless anomalies. But But it always is a surprise to me to think that though this closed up hardness of a city was my only experience of the world, yet my mind was constantly haunted by the homesick fancies of an exile. It seems that the subconscious remembrance of a primeval dwelling place, where in our ancestors' minds were figured and voiced the mysteries of the inarticulate rocks, the rushing water, and the dark whispers of the forest, was constantly stirring my blood with its call. Some shadow haunting living reminiscence in me seemed to ache for the prenatal cradle and playground it shared with the primal life in the illimitable magic of the land, water, and air. The shrill, thin cry of the high-flying kite in the blazing sun of the dazed Indian midday sent to a solitary boy the signal of a dumb, distant kinship. The few coconut plants growing by the boundary wall of our house, like some war captives from an older army of invaders of this earth, spoke to me of the eternal companionship which the great brotherhood of trees has ever offered to man. Looking back upon those moments of my boyhood days, when all my mind seemed to float poised upon a large feeling of the sky, of the light, and to tingle with the brown earth in its glistening grass, I cannot help believing that my Indian ancestry had left deep in my being the legacy of its philosophy. The philosophy which speaks of fulfillment through our harmony with all things. The founding of my school had its origin in the memory of that longing for the freedom of consciousness, which seems to go back beyond the skyline of my birth. Freedom, in the mere sense of independence, has no content and therefore no meaning. Perfect freedom lies in a perfect harmony of relationship, which we realize in this world not through our response to it in knowing, but in being. Objects of knowledge maintain an infinite distance from us, who are the knowers. For knowledge is not union. Therefore, the further world of freedom awaits us there where we reach truth, not through feeling it by our senses or knowing it by our reason, but through the union of perfect sympathy. Children with the freshness of their senses come directly to the intimacy of this world. This is the first great gift they have. They must accept it naked and simple and must never again lose their power of immediate communication with it. For our perfection, we have to be vitally savage and mentally civilized. We should have the gift to be natural with nature and human with human society. My banished soul, sitting in the civilized isolation of the town life, cried within me for the enlargement of the horizon of its comprehension. I was like the torn away line of a verse, always in a state of suspense, while the other line, with which it rhymed and which could give it fullness, was smudged by the mist away in some undecipherable distance. The inexpensive power to be happy, which, along with other children, I brought to this world, was being constantly worn away by friction with the brick and mortar arrangement of life, by monotonously mechanical habits and the customary code of respectability. In the usual course of things, I was sent to school. But possibly my suffering was unusually greater than that of most other children. The non-civilized in me was sensitive. It had the great thirst for color, for music, for movement of life. Our city-built education took no heed of that living fact. It had its luggage van waiting for branded bales of marketable result. The relative proportion of the non-civilized to the civilized in man should be in the proportion of the water and the land in our globe, the former predominating. But the school had for its object a continual reclamation of the civilized. Such a drain in the fluid element causes an aridity which may not be considered deplorable under city conditions. But my nature never got accustomed to those conditions, to the callous decency of the pavement. The non-civilized triumphed in me only too soon and drove me away from school when I had just entered my teens. I found myself stranded on a solitary island of ignorance and had to rely solely upon my own instincts to build up my education from the very beginning. This reminds me that when I was young, I had the great good fortune of coming upon a Bengali translation of Robinson Crusoe. I still believe that it is the best book for boys that has ever been written. There was a longing in me when young to run away from my own self and be one with everything in nature. This mood appears to be particularly Indian, the outcome of a traditional desire for the expansion of consciousness. One has to admit that such a desire is too subjective in its character. But this is inevitable in the geographical circumstances which we have to endure. We live under the extraordinary tyranny of the tropics, paying heavy toll every moment for the barest right of existence. The heat, the damp, the unspeakable fecundity of minute life feeding upon big life, the perpetual sources of irritation, visible and invisible, leave very little margin of capital for extravagant experiments. Excess of energy seeks obstacles for its self-realization. That is why we find so often in Western literature a constant emphasis upon the malignant aspect of nature, in whom the people of the West seem to be delighted to discover an enemy for the sheer enjoyment of challenging her to fight. The reason which made Alexander express his desire to find other worlds to conquer, when his conquest of the world was completed, makes the enormously vital people of the West desire, when they have some respite in their sublime mission of fighting against objects that are noxious, to go out of their way. I lost my spot here. To go out of their way to spread their coattails in other people's thoroughfares and to claim indemnity when these are trodden upon. In order to make the thrilling risk of hurting themselves, they are ready to welcome endless trouble to hurt others who are inoffensive, such as the beautiful birds which happen to know how to fly away, the timid beasts which have the advantage of inhabiting inaccessible regions. But I avoid the discourtesy of mentioning higher races in this connection. life's fulfillment finds constant contradictions in its path, but those are necessary for the sake of its advance. The stream is saved from the sluggishness of its current by the perpetual opposition of the soil through which it must cut its way. It is this soil which forms its banks. The spirit of fight belongs to the genius of life. The tuning of an instrument has to be done, not because it reveals a proficient perseverance in the face of difficulty, but because it helps music to be perfectly realized. Let us rejoice that in the West, life's instrument is being tuned in all its different chords, owing to the great fact that the West has triumphant pleasure in the struggle with obstacles. The spirit of creation in the heart of the universe will never allow, for its own sake, obstacles to be completely removed. It is only because positive truth lies in that ideal of perfection, which has to be won by our own endeavor in order to make it our own, that the spirit of fight is great. But this does not imply a premium for the exhibition of a muscular athleticism or a rude barbarism of ravenous rapacity. In Robinson Crusoe, the delight of the union with nature finds its expression in a story of adventure in which the solitary man is face to face with solitary nature, coaxing her, cooperating with her, exploring her secrets, using all his faculties to win her help. This is the heroic love adventure of the West, the active wooing of the earth. I remember how, once in my youth, the feeling of intense delight and wonder followed me in my railway journey across Europe from Brindisi to Calais, when I realized the chaste beauty of this continent everywhere blossoming in a glow of health and richness under the age-long attention of her chivalrous lover, Western humanity. He had gained her, made her his own, unlocked the inexhaustible generosity of her heart. And I had intently wished that the introspective vision of the universal soul, which an Eastern devotee realizes in the solitude of his mind, could be united with this spirit of its outward expression in service. The exercise of will in unfolding the wealth of beauty and well-being from its shy obscurity to the light. I remember the morning when a beggar woman in a Bengal village gathered in the loose end of her sari the stale flowers that were about to be thrown away from the vase on my table, and with an ecstatic expression of tenderness, buried her face in them, exclaiming, "Oh, beloved of my heart." Her eyes could easily pierce the veil of the outward form and reach the realm of the infinite in these flowers, where she found the intimate touch of her beloved, the great, the universal human. But in spite of it all, she lacked that energy of worship, that Western form of direct divine service, the service of man, which helps the earth to bring out her flowers and spread the rain of beauty on the desolate dust. I refuse to think that the twin spirits of the East and the West, the Mary and Martha, can never meet to make perfect the realization of truth. And in spite of our material poverty in the East and the antagonism of time, I wait patiently for this meeting. Robinson Crusoe's island comes to my mind when I think of some institution where the first great lesson in the perfect union of man and nature, not only through love, but through active communication and intelligent ways, can be had unobstructed. We have to keep in mind the fact that love and action are the only intermediaries through which perfect knowledge can be obtained. For the object of knowledge is not pedantry, but wisdom. The primary object of an institution should not be merely to educate one's limbs and mind to be in efficient readiness for all emergencies, but to be in perfect tune in the symphony of response between life and world, to find the balance of their harmony, which is wisdom. The first important lesson for children in such a place would be that of improvisation, the constant imposition of the ready-made having been too far.
Sorry. Here it is, having been banished from here.
The constant imposition of the ready-made having been banished from here. It is to give occasions to explore one's capacity through surprises of achievement. I must make it plain that this means a lesson not in simple life, but in creative life. For life may grow complex, and yet if there is a living personality in its center, it will still have the unity of creation. It will carry its own weight in perfect grace and will not be a mere addition to the number of facts that only goes to swell a crowd. I wish I could say that I had fully realized my dream in my school. I have only made the first introduction towards it and have given an opportunity to the children to find their freedom in nature by being able to love it. For love is freedom. It gives us that fullness of existence which saves us from paying with our soul for objects that are immensely cheap. Love lights up this world with its meaning and makes life feel that it has that enough everywhere, which truly is its feast. I know men who preach the cult of simple life by glorifying the spiritual merit of poverty. I refuse to imagine any special value in poverty when it is a mere negation. Only when the mind, can you
Oh, sorry.
that?
Yep.
There. Only when the mind has the sensitiveness to be able to respond to the deeper call of reality is it naturally weaned away from the lure of the fictitious value of things. It is callousness which robs us of our simple power to enjoy and dooms us to the indignity of a snobbish pride in furniture and the foolish burden of expensive things. But the callousness of aestheticism pitted against the callousness of luxury is merely fighting one evil with the help of another, inviting the pitiless demon of the desert in place of the indiscriminate demon of the jungle. I tried my best to develop in the children of my school the freshness of their feeling for nature, a sensitiveness of soul in their relationship with their human surroundings, with the help of literature, festive ceremonials, and also the religious teaching which enjoins us to come to the nearer presence of the world through the soul. Thus, to gain it more than can be measured, like gaining an instrument in truth by bringing out its music.
Beautiful.
Wow,
That's good.
that was quite poetical, that whole chapter.
That has been a theme.
Absolutely. That chapter could have been the only chapter of the book.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I loved how he brought up Robinson Crusoe so much. Because I that book, it really is the most important thing for young people to read. I find I was overjoyed when I'd only read it because I had read Henry C. Carey, and Carey was just always using Robinson Crusoe as his guide to talking about the science of economy. And I was like, well, I've got to read Robinson Crusoe. And yeah, sure enough, it's has everyone here heard of the book Robinson Crusoe? Obviously, we just heard him say it, but has everyone not read it, or has anyone not read it?
I think I read it when I was a kid, but
Yeah. Yeah, me too. I read it when I was young. It's been a long time. But you kind of remember it. Wasn't he found himself on an abandoned island all alone?
Yeah, he after a shipwreck. But what's
Yes.
great is it's really like everything in the book is a metaphor of the soul's journey from folly into wisdom, and how we transform by making choices, and those choices have to be based upon love ultimately, and a concern for the future. And at every moment, if he didn't make certain choices, you could always go reflect back and realize that he would have died again and again and again if he hadn't just chosen to learn a new skill, to learn basket weaving, to learn how to do this new, to hunt something, to venture somewhere, to build a certain type of boat. But he always to learn how to build, like little clay pots and experiment arduously to making these different things. And yeah, it's really, and by the end of it, he actually has become a being of wisdom and love. But yeah, it's strong. So it's a real guide to how an economy works, right? It's a little microcosm of how human society works by working with nature and with ourselves, and developing technologies from the right reasons.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, Kevin, if you're ever looking for a book to read with your kids, Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah, I read that a couple of years ago. It was fantastic, and trying to get my son into it. The language is a bit, archaic.
Yeah, it's true.
It'd be good to learn that.
Mm-hmm.
Was that Defoe who wrote that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
So what else? Do people know why he called this it was called The Teacher, right?
mhm.
Yeah.
It was an interesting choice of title.
For the meeting, The Teacher.
And
Yeah.
why do you guys think, like in the beginning of the chapter, he alluded a lot to, you mean, the civilized and the non-civilized, and he spoke about his journey throughout school, that I mean, they were always trying to civilize him, but he always had that part of him that was uncivilized, and that yearned for something that was that was not offered in school. Like, what was he actually alluding to when he spoke about the non-civilized?
The civilized is not something good, okay? Because the civilized is the second and third line of the lower trigram, okay? The uncivilized precisely is the vitality, is the first line, but that line is not bad. However, in the schooling process, I think that we clip the wings of the children, of the kids, by imposing on them a set of instructions, okay, for the intellect and for the conventional truth, precisely that the civilized thing that is imposed upon the kids. And precisely he was rebelling against that, because he explained that it's from his Indian roots and so on, and probably it's true, but it's against the imposition of a intellectual and conventional truth cage that he was against. And he discovered that precisely by the more uncivilized dimension of sense of perception, that able to jump to the upper trigram, precisely to the dimension of love, and not of impose civilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And at the first page, he wrote something incredible, because it goes back precisely to the notions of that Roman notions of osium, okay, otium, that is the free time that a free man will give to himself to develop his soul. I try to find it. It's page 170 that I wrote.
Ocean or
Osium, O-T-I-U-M. It's a Latin word. It's not written in the chapter, but what I mean that everything he wrote in this chapter is precisely that ancient Roman ideal of osium. Okay, that the free man should devote his energy at the beginning, end of the chapter. Okay, Tagore will talk about the fact that we should not pay the price of our soul for things who are, after all, quite cheap. Okay, because I find this absolutely gorgeous. Okay, because that's true. Each time that a piece of your soul, each time that you put your energy in something, you pay it with a piece of your soul. And precisely at page 179, okay, at the end, it is callousness which robs us of our simple power to enjoy and dooms us to the indignity of a snobbish pride in furniture and the foolish burden of expensive things. The callousness of asceticism pitted against the callousness of luxury is merely fighting one evil with the help of another, inviting the pitiless demon of the desert in place of the indiscriminate demon of the jungle. I go a bit up. I wish I could say that I had fully realized my dream in my school. We made the first introduction towards it and have given an opportunity to the children to find their freedom in nature by being able to love it. For love is freedom. It gives us that fullness of existence which saves us from paying with our soul for objects that are immensely cheap. Love lights up this world with its meaning and makes life feel that it has that enough everywhere, which truly is its feast. So when he was speaking in a bad sense of civilization, he was thinking of conventional truth, okay, the third line of the lower trigram of the animal kingdom. And this conventional truth is given to us through the schooling process. And it's what in North America people are called the rat race, okay? That's the rat race, okay? If you are pulled into the rat race by the conventional truth and you did not find a way to escape to the upper kingdom, to the divine kingdom, you're dead. And I'm so excited that Tagore, who was born in 1861, was already capable to see it.
Yeah.
Because he was a poet, of course, because poets are prophets, of course, and he saw it in advance.
Yeah. And this reminds me so much of, there's a dialogue by Plato called the Philebus dialogue on the nature of how do you judge good and evil, and is pleasure and pain adequate standards? And in it, he spends a lot of time looking at, well, what is the essence? What causes pleasure and pain? And they spent a lot of time discussing the question of having too much of or too little of something, whether you overeat or you undereat, you're in pain in both cases, right? But when you're filling, when you're under eating, when you have an absence of something quantitatively, you yearn for being full. So there's this sort of harmony that you're yearning for, and that's giving you pleasure as you're going towards it.
Yeah.
And
And
I think it's the same.
hold on, just one,
Sorry.
just wanted to wrap that up. But he's always asking, well, how do we get beyond the more and less, the pleasure and pain dichotomy, into something higher that's outside of that qualitatively? And his interlocutor is like, well, what could that be? I mean, all there is pleasure and pain. It's one or the other. And the question of satisfaction comes up, right? Like, how do you go for a harmony, a satisfaction, which is a pleasure that is more than the type of pleasure which is just an absence or like a fulfillment of something quantitative. So anyway, there was just that idea that awoke in my mind as I was listening to you talking about Tagore's idea of, the ascetic versus the callousness of the desert versus the callousness of the jungle, the tyrant who has too much versus, the person who is also without love, who has too little. They're both absences. That was it. You can, sorry, you can go for it.
No, I just wanted to, I think also because you're alluding to a text by Plato. I think also in the what's the text? You mean when Socrates drinks the hemlock?
Phaedo.
Yeah, Phaedo. So at the beginning, I think he's also attached, like, so the guards attach his leg with a chain, and when his friends come in, the chain is removed, and he makes the same illusion that you see, where there was pain, now there is pleasure, and just to make this, you mean that pain and pleasure kind of coexist. You can't have one without the other. But it kind of probably goes your way when you're saying that. You mean you having too much of something makes you yearn for the other side.
Well, yeah, and there's this question of the pleasure of the spirit versus the pleasure of the flesh. So the pleasures and pains of the flesh are very different. They have a different set of rules than the pleasure and pain of the soul, right? Because can you have like too much cake? Oh yeah, your physical body can have too much cake, but can you have too much justice, or can you be sick on discoveries? It's like, no, it's different, right? It doesn't work the same way anymore. And I was thinking about, as you were talking, Quan, the idea also, I was thinking on a lower level of what I loved about Robinson Crusoe the first time when I started speaking about it, but I was thinking more about it from the standpoint of what Tagore was going through personally, of as far as like his own asceticism, his own inwardness, and how at a certain point he had this longing for reuniting with the eternal and God, that had him at a certain point. He started his school and started going outside of himself at a certain time. And I was just thinking to myself a little bit of the in Robinson Crusoe too, like this guy as a young man is very he's not reacting well to the rigid structure of 17th century Europe. He's born into a higher upper middle class family with all of these rules and expectations of what his life should be. Everything is sort of planned out for him, and he just is spiritually in turmoil. and he rejects it. And he wants instead to adventure and to see the world and not just be like a bureaucrat or an accountant in an office, like the way his father wants him to be. And he ends up, secretively joining a ship, a merchant ship, without telling his family, and goes off. But he's trying to find his place in the universe, and in a world that is so unnatural and rigid, but he's a fool. But he could be no other way than a fool, because his society wasn't able to cultivate the right human development for him that would give him his maturity. And so that's what sort of sets him off on this journey, whereby by the end of it, you have sort of somebody who by being by himself on this island for like 20 years and going through the experiences and choices that he then comes out as this integrated human being who is the type of socialized character that strikes that balance, who could be an invaluable part of society, by going back into civilization again. But
Yeah. Well, you have to be truly civilized in order to use the mass that are required of you, in the sense that you can only use your personality if you have an individuality and your universal self.
Mm-hmm.
Because he would be a total robot if he accepted to be smarter precisely by what I call the third line, the conventional truth, fed forcibly into him through his intellect. And he found in himself the energy to rebel and to get to the upper trigram. From there, because he was capable to have his individuality, by the power of universal self, he was then capable to play with the society in which he was, rather than to be imposed the stations of a specific rat race corresponding to the Victorian era. Because even if the expression rat race will be created later on, there has always been race in every era of human history.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the true civilization precisely would be the civilization that when should give that upper trigram to one, because I'd say that till now, most civilization, even the greatest one, were capable to create a lower trigram with the conventional truth and so on, with some shining person inviting to the upper trigram. But it has always been personal adventure and not something that has been granted collectively through a good education system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the question of. Cynthia and I were talking earlier on today about how young people have a lot of energy, and I was thinking about some of the encounters I had in a political organization here in Montreal. And as a young person, you have a lot of folly, you have a lot of energy, but you have a lot of yearning for creativity, and you also have a lot of yearning to find authority. Like you want, like all children want authority. We want to find boundary conditions, and that's why kids, I guess, go through their terrible twos, because they're sort of testing, right? They're seeing where are the boundary conditions, and as you continue to grow, you continue to test things, to challenge things, to look for hypocrisy or whatever, and you're always pushing, but you're pushing because you kind of want to find an authority that you can respect. And in a teacher in school, like a good teacher is a teacher who can play back with the students and treats the kids, like they got a soul, and the kids will earn the respect of the kids. Or we were thinking about Franklin Roosevelt versus like a totalitarian dictator. because Roosevelt liked like, of course, he wanted political power, centralized political power. Does that make him a dictator? No, because he was able to communicate through his fireside chats in a very loving way why the policies that he knew were necessary, what he was able to communicate that to the population, right? Every step of the way. And he was having a constant dialogue to make it reasonable and to make it bring people to a level of understanding where they were participating and they weren't being forced to do anything or forced to have their behavior modified the way a bad teacher would, that would just expect you to memorize the formulas or whatever. So yeah, like this question of this primal, this uncivilized and civilized self. Like the uncivilized is looking for freedom. It's the side of us that wants to have real being, and the civilized part is like the formal structures that have their necessity in a certain way, but they cannot take priority to the being. Like he was saying, the knowledge is just like, if it's just knowledge, it's far removed from who we are. If it's not earned, if it's not awoken from within us, and if we're not being the knowledge, but we're just having the knowledge put into us by reading something that isn't coming from us, it's not us. So it's the schism will always remain unless we can break that.
I would say that the compromise that has been found in many cultures is that that high education most of the time would be given to an elite, okay? But the problem of that solution is that the elite, when they generate at a certain level, and it would not be truly bringing forth what is within, but rather maintaining certain privileges inside a certain number of families, if you want. And that's the big problem of true meritocracy. And I would say that we did not find a definite formula, and the word formula is clear, but a definite setting to maintain a persistent meritocracy through times, meaning through centuries, and not through some deeds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Matt, wanted the thing you said earlier about children in school. I know from, Madeline being a teacher that young children, they like order. They like a structure to their day, and they get used to it. And when you change that order, it destabilizes them something. But I think they see a teacher who is giving them order out of chaos. They don't like chaos. And if you give them that order, but with a reason, they respond to that. Whereas, if you just give them the order saying that's the way we've always done it, or we do it this way because that's the way I say we're going to do it, they don't really respond to that. So there's two different kind of orders.
Mm-hmm.
They like the one where there's a reason to the order,
right.
But where it's just arbitrary, this is it, they don't like that at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing I've learned from Madeline.
Yeah, but Jerry, even grown up, they need stories. So we go back again the concept of myth making, to the concept of narratives of common projects, and maybe precisely the children, they need a reason, because maybe we need a mythology, and most of the successful civilization, they have created awesome mythology to bring their people together for a common destiny, and it's part of the machinery with the capital M of true civilizations, because a true civilization is not only the scientific, the technological, the material part is also the poetry that make obvious the upper diagram of truth, goodness, and beauty.
Mhm.
And I want to discuss something very down to earth, okay? Because within a population, you have to be aware that not everyone is at the same level of epistemological development. So that's the people having being the most advanced in epistemological development precisely need to create a framework within which everyone would feel that he is at his place and value at his place.
Mhm.
And there we escape precisely the hierarchical mentality, because I think it's a reality that not everyone is at the same epistemological development, and how things can be done so that everyone would feel value and not being simply oppressed or in a subordinate position. Okay, but because once again, that reality of differences in epistemological development, it's a universal reality. I don't think I'm being stating that.
You're such an elitist. No, I'm joking.
Yes, I know. It's in my DNA. I cannot do. It's too late now, Matt.
But I think Tagore was like that too,
Hmm.
that he realized that in himself. And I think that's why he started his school, as a way to give this to others, to bring it out in others.
Mhm.
Yes, I think it's the marker between a tyrant and someone trying to do his best, okay? That he's trying to offer it to others. Doesn't mean that he will succeed, but he will try somehow to give it to the most people possible.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm.
Mhm. And also, I like where Tagore brought up this idea that he was against mere negation, that, if you're trying to move from the lower trigram to the upper trigram, you can't do it from simply mere negation of what you think is animal pleasures towards, intellectual pleasures, say. That I really like that he was very explicit in that, saying against mere negation, and also the necessity for poetic thinking in terms of being able to accomplish that mere negation couldn't do it. I know he used the example of poverty, but it's also, I think, intellectually as well, he could use that.
Mhm.
Because isn't that Immanuel Kant, his idea of negation? So kind of attacking that.
Or what's the Aristotelian idea of virtue? It's like the mean between vices or something like that. Or
Yeah.
so-
Well, Aristotle was the ancestors of the cybernetics theoreticians. It's
right.
a stochastic. It's a stochastic mix.
Mm-hmm.
You put You put everything in a blender, and the blender would give you creativity, truth, and goodness and beauty. So it would be the new name for God is the super blender.
Creative destroyer.
Yeah.
Oh,
The destroying creator.
super blender. Hmm. That's funny.
Well, yeah, definitely. He said it too, like the idea of real freedom versus fake freedom, as far as and he likens it to an investigation of independence, of just being independent versus being free through a harmony of relationships,
Mhm.
and a sympathy, a union of perfect sympathy, as being the pathway to an actual competent understanding of what freedom is. So it's like a real good remedy to the libertarians among us today who all can't reconcile the general welfare of the society that they're part of versus their personal welfare and happiness. You know, there's this absolute dichotomy they just refuse to try to resolve, and everything just becomes, you know, like we were listening to a skit of Jon Stewart and his new show, which isn't bad, but he's obviously still got a lot of COVID propaganda that he's drank the Kool-Aid on. But he's a funny guy. He's more likable than Stephen Colbert, and he had a bunch of clips from a bunch of right wingers who are all, you know, supporting bills that bail out Wall Street banks in the trillions of dollars, but they rail on anybody who proposes universal health care as being socialist and thus Nazi. And like the level of just blindsidedness that they're allowing for general, like, socialism for the banks, but not for people who need it.
Socialism for the profits and privatization for the losses,
Yeah,
Yeah.
or the other way around.
Exactly.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. But there's a word in English for that. Democracy.
Hypocrisy. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Hypocrisy.
And
Hey, that's a good one. Yeah.
yeah.
New word. I just made a word. Am I a
Yeah.
poet?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sure. Sure.
No one's allowed to
Oh,
use it. It's my word.
hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy. What did you say?
Hypocrisy, word of the hypocrite.
Hypocrisy.
But I still prefer KFC because what is extraordinary in war is he was denouncing the KFC, and because it was almost a centuries ago.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what KFC stands for in the Quan lexicon? The Quanticon? It's kakistocratic. What's the next part?
Feudal conglomerate.
Kakistocratic feudal conglomerate. Yes. Love it.
Yeah.
And kakistocratic is a wonderful, wonderful term. The rule by the absolute worst.
It's an idiocracy.
Yeah, exactly. A form of idiocracy. And what is beautiful is that you can also say cacocracy or cacocracy as a synonym of kakistocracy. Okay, so in French, it's le caca.
Perfect.
So
Look,
Well, guys, we're pushing 10 o'clock. This is fun. This is always good. All right. So this Sunday we have a presentation. What was that, Quan? Or some who said that?
just a small question.
Yeah.
Were you busy last Wednesday? Was it because of the events in Kazakhstan?
There was a lot. I had a bunch of interviews to prepare for, and yeah. I wasn't. I had nothing to do with the
Okay.
events in Kazakhstan. No.
And Matt, don't try to deny the reality.
Right on. An Israeli-run video conference call. Thanks. All right, must make a mental note at this time signature to edit this out. Okay. So yeah, we'll definitely have a class by Jonathan Tenenbaum on Chinese culture, with a focus on a little bit more of our recent age, the good and the bad, with a focus on the good. And yeah, we'll move on from there. So that'll be this Sunday at 2:00. People are welcome. Is that Courtney? Is that Courtney in the background? No? Okay. Yeah, so people are welcome to bring invite friends or family or anybody else who you think would be interested in learning about China on Sunday.
Okay.